James P. Dyer, Black Pioneer in San Francisco, Potrero Hill History Night, November 6th, 2021. A video by the Potrero Hill Archives Project. The gold rush is San Francisco's foundation myth, the story of miners, entrepreneurs, bankers, prostitutes, and gamblers from around the world who came in search of instant wealth and built San Francisco almost overnight, the population exploding from 800 to 30,000 in 1 year. Gold Rush images, miners, cowboys, and Wells Fargo wagons have become familiar cliches. San Francisco's Gold Rush Harbor was unforgettable. Many of the masts of the more than 600 abandoned ships docked in San Francisco belonged to whalers from New England, whose crews had deserted for the gold mines. New York reporter Bayard Taylor's description of 1849 San Francisco brings it to life. The renowned harbor, crowded with the shipping of the world, mast behind mast and vessel behind vessel, the flags of all nations fluttering in the breeze. The streets were full of people hurrying to and fro, and of as diverse and bizarre a character as the houses. Yankees of all possible variety, native Californians in serapes and sombreros, Chileans, Kanakas from Hawaii, Chinese with long tails, Malays, and others in whose embrowned and bearded visages it was impossible to recognize any especial nationality. But this avalanche of humanity didn't come only for gold. They came to free themselves from bleak futures on prairie farmlands, from political and economic upheaval far away, and from strict social expectations. For Black Americans, it was a place to establish autonomy, to challenge racist laws and the institution of slavery. While some Gold Rush images are quite familiar, why are the images of Black pioneers so unfamiliar? This large wooden industrial building on Potrero Hill is part of a remarkable and largely neglected history. It was once the Queen Lily Soap Factory, a business originally established by James P. Dyer, a Black Gold Rush pioneer who came to San Francisco in 1850. James P. Dyer was born a free person of color in 1818 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, the same year Frederick Douglass was born. His father, also named James, had probably been enslaved. The name James Dyer is found on both lists of U.S. slave owners and on Jamaican slave registers. I'm struck by similarities between James P. Dyer's birthplace and his later home, San Francisco. New Bedford is long and narrow, with 20 piers projecting into the deep waters of a bay, forming a safe harbor near whale migration routes. While the economies of most Massachusetts cities were based on manufacturing, New Bedford's incredible wealth came from maritime commerce. By the 1850s, New Bedford was described as perhaps the wealthiest city in the world, redolent of oil and bursting with promise. Whale oil was the main source for home and industrial lighting around the world. used in soap and to lubricate machinery in growing industrial economies. One whale could provide 3 tons of whale oil, and for 90 years, New Bedford provided over 45% of American whale oil. Whale oil was New Bedford's gold. A local historian tells us that there were 2 New Bedfords, one a fair and dignified city on a hilltop with patrician mansions and opulent gardens, the homes of whaling merchants and their captains. And then the other squalid sections of town where sailors and those who preyed upon them, the saloons, boarding houses, and dance halls, where delirium and death were sold. There was even a brothel in a grounded whaling ship in the center of town, and 78 liquor shops. James P. Dyer grew up in the south end of New Bedford, where children begged for food, a neighborhood still home to many people of color today. The whaling industry was extremely dangerous, but more open to people of color than many others. We see this in the crew of Captain Ahab in Melville's Moby Dick, which was inspired by the true story of the whaler Essex. However, the Essex's crew was forced to resort to cannibalism, a fact which Melville left out. New Bedford had a reputation as a place of refuge for escaped enslaved people, with up to 700 fugitives living there between 1854 and 1863. Near the waterfront, James P. Dyer's family ran a small, crowded boarding house next to a pond on South Water Street, catering to about 20 Hawaiian seamen hoping to find whaling jobs. James P. Dyer probably attended an African Methodist Episcopal church where he could have heard the eloquent sermons of Frederick Douglass, who had recently escaped slavery in Maryland and come to New Bedford with his wife on the Underground Railroad. In 1834, New Bedford suffered its first terrifying outbreak of cholera, which was part of a pandemic that swept across Asia, Europe, and then into the Americas. Cholera was called the blue disease for obvious reasons. New Bedford city officials announced that the source of the outbreak was the Dyer boarding house and cited the filthy conditions and dissolute habits of the tenants. When James Dyer's father heard this accusation, he went into a rage and attacked 2 city officials with rawhide straps and stones. He was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 4 years in prison. When the time came for his release, his wife, fearing that he would kill her, and his son, James P. Dyer, petitioned authorities to keep him out of New Bedford. Although James P. Dyer's father was prone to violence, racism could easily have played a part in this story. Soon afterwards, when he was 21, James P. Dyer joined a whaling voyage on the Minerva, a ship that was 112 feet long, a merchant ship that had been converted to a square-rigged Yankee whaler, a kind of floating factory which boiled strips of whale blubber to extract the oil. James P. Dyer was one of 2 African American men on the crew, and here we see his name on the crew list. A whaler describes a similar ship. The smell of the burning cracklings is too horribly nauseous for description. It is as though all the ill odors in the world were gathered together and being shaken up. From this smell and taste of blubber, raw, boiling, and burning, there is no relief or place of refuge. James P. Dyer spent 3 years on this voyage, which took him to Brazil, around Cape Horn, and to the Bay of Islands in New Zealand, which we see here, before returning home. Back in New Bedford, he became a soap maker and married Sabina Taylor in 1848. Their daughter Anne was born soon after. Meanwhile, Mr. Dyer read newspaper articles about the astonishing amounts of gold coming out of California mines, and about San Francisco, where wages and prices for goods had risen to astronomical heights. Cook's wages are $100 a month, $3,500 today. Eggs, $3 a dozen, $105 today. And it is not uncommon to cart gold dust from one store to another. Black Americans, like thousands of people around the world, saw an opportunity for economic and social advancement and dropped everything to find passage to San Francisco. In 1849, Frederick Douglass wrote in the abolitionist paper The Liberator, "Not one of the company of colored persons from New Bedford expresses any regret at going to California, and all seem delighted with the prospect before them. For once, labor has found a place where it bids fair to be amply rewarded." In that same issue of The Liberator, in a letter from San Francisco signed by 40 black men from New England, many of them from New Bedford, the organization of a mutual benefit and relief society was announced, both for themselves and for newcomers, adding that each was doing well, making an impressive $3,500 to $10,000 a month in today's dollars. How could James P. Dyer not go? The Dyer family left for San Francisco in 1850, joining what would become the largest U.S. migration until the 20th century. James was 31, Sabina 25, Anne less than a year. The New Bedford Directory of 1852 lists James Dyer's address and the address of many men from the city as simply California. There were 3 routes west, and 2 were particularly dangerous. The first, quite rough, went overland across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. The second, by steamship to Panama, then by canoe and mule train across the malaria-ridden Isthmus of Panama, where, with luck, one might pick up a steamer to San Francisco. It seems most likely that James Dyer and his family took the route around Cape Horn that he'd taken earlier on a whaler, and then up the coasts of South and North America to San Francisco. The voyage could easily have taken 6 months on a ship like this, advertised as a well-known and splendid little extreme clipper ship. The Dyer family arrived at San Francisco's docks in 1850, and they would have seen either the smoldering ruins from one of 7 fires that burned the city between 1849 and 1851, or the rebuilding that took place almost overnight. Bayard Taylor again helps us see that San Francisco. Every newcomer in San Francisco is overtaken with a sense of complete bewilderment. One knows not whether he is awake or in some wonderful dream. Never have I had so much difficulty in establishing satisfactorily to my own sense the reality of what I saw and heard. The very air is pregnant with the magnetism of bold-spirited, unwearied action, and he who but ventures into the outer circle of the whirlpool is spinning ere he has time for thought in its dizzy vortex. The Dyer family moved to the sandy slopes of Knob, then called Fern Hill, and Russian Hill, high above the waterfront to John Street in a neighborhood called Spring Valley, at that time the sparsely built western edge of the rapidly growing city. Spring Valley's underground springs fed a bathhouse and a dye works on a plot of ground called the Doomed Valley for several businesses which had failed there. Those springs would be useful in the soap-making factory that James Dyer established there in 1852. In this panorama, the small white building is likely that first soap factory. In 1852, the Dyers' neighbors were Australians, Mexicans, Irish, and Germans, but the area soon became the first permanent African American community in the West. Despite San Francisco's chaos, the Dyers must have felt at home, having moved from the largest community of free people of color in the North to the largest black community in the West. Between 1852 and 1860, San Francisco's African American population would almost triple, growing from 460 to 1,175. Most black residents were literate free people of color from Northeast cities, mainly New York, Philadelphia, and New Bedford, where abolitionism and Frederick Douglass's speeches encouraged the push for equality and human rights. Most black pioneers were young and adventurous, and the social fluidity of frontier life would have suggested the possibility of racial equality. Other black San Franciscans came as fugitive enslaved people who mined for gold to buy their freedom. And yet others came with white settlers from southern slave states. When these enslaved people were sent to the gold fields to do the hard work of mining in place of their white owners, it violated the 49ers' code of ethics, which rejected the idea of any man doing another's work. In 1850, the year of the Dyers' arrival, California entered the Union as the 35th state. The unresolved issue of slavery threatened to tear the Union apart. Would California become a slave or free state and tip the balance? Public opinion was complicated. Some proponents of a free California were simply afraid that slaves would unfairly compete with white gold miners. Other white Californians, influenced by popular pseudoscientific theories of phrenology and the recently classified races, which Frederick Douglass called scientific moonshine, wanted to ban all African Americans, free and enslaved, from the state. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California to the Union as a free state, but with provisions that hardly guaranteed freedom. The new state strengthened the fugitive slave law, which required the return of escaped slaves to their owners. It also denied slaves a trial and the right to testify on their own behalf. African Americans in California were also denied the vote, partly from fear that if black men were allowed to vote, the much larger Chinese community would also demand the vote. In 1850, the euphemistically titled Act for the Government and Protection of Indians wrote into law the virtual enslavement of Native Americans in California. This led to the kidnapping and sale of thousands of Native American children. And it got much worse. In 1852, California passed its own Fugitive Slave Act, which required Black residents to prove they lived in the state prior to statehood. Without that proof, a free Black person could theoretically be sold into slavery. And incredibly, in 1858, the California legislature would pass a law banning Black immigration, although the bill was never enacted. This structural racism stands in stark contrast to the myth of a free California. When Archie Lee, a slave from Mississippi, was brought to California in 1857, he fled and faced being returned to slavery. The Black communities in Sacramento and San Francisco, along with white abolitionists, mobilized and raised thousands of dollars for his defense. They also alerted police about his owner's attempt to kidnap Mr. Lee. This landmark case went all the way to the California Supreme Court, who first ruled that Archie Lee should be returned to his owner. But his supporters rioted outside Kearny Street Hall of Justice, which we see here, where he was being held. And when the case was retried, Archie Lee was judged a free man because his owner had settled in California, a free state. In 1851, James P. Dyer established the New England Soap Factory in Spring Valley through a partnership with Peter Van Winkle, a white Dutch New Yorker. Newspaper ads in 1855 announced, "Soap, soap, soap, candles, candles, candles," at J. P. Dyer's New England Soap Factory. Located on Mason near Pacific, just about above the Broadway Tunnel today. A series of loans, foreclosures, and petitions for insolvency between 1857 and 1866 show that James P. Dyer had a series of financial problems, but the soap-making factory he established continued through partnerships and loans. The award for Best Exhibit of California-made soap went to James Dyer at the 1857 State Fair in Stockton. But by 1862, Mr. Dyer's neighborhood was increasingly residential, and neighbors complained that the effluvia and smoke arising from the soap-making operations are exceedingly disagreeable and have an unhealthful effect upon the atmosphere, and that the stench is so heavy as to kill all the flies in the neighborhood and keep the dogs from howling at night. One of the neighbors who complained was Henry Haight, who lived directly across the street from the factory on Pacific. Mr. Haight eventually became governor of California, and he asserted in his inauguration speech that Reconstruction disenfranchises enough white men to give control to a mass of Negroes just emancipated and just as ignorant of political duties as beasts of the field. Racism certainly played a part in Mr. Haight's complaints against Mr. Dyer. Interestingly, at the trial, fellow soap manufacturers testified, claiming that soap making was actually quite healthy, and they called attention to Mr. Dyer himself, who, weighing about 300 pounds, obviously had robust health. But the jury was not convinced, and in 1864, Mr. Dyer was fined $50 and lost most of his factory, valued at $18,000. He moved his factory to what had become the new southern edge of town, the Potrero, once the pasture land for Mission Dolores's cattle, and where other smelly, dangerous, or disruptive businesses were already located, including soap, gunpowder, and glue factories, and a number of slaughterhouses along Mission Creek. But more significant than Mr. Dyer's work as a manufacturer of soap was his continuing work with and for people of color in California. This community made important contributions to the education, political, legal, and social advancement of people of color in California. In 1862, Mr. Dyer became president of the San Francisco Athenaeum and Literary Society, an organization that provided a free library with 800 books, a reading room, and a saloon where Black men and women could find American and foreign periodicals and the latest newspapers from Europe. The Athenaeum also held lectures and debates and became a Black cultural and political center, a tradition which continues today through the San Francisco African American Cultural and Historical Society on Fulton Street. From the 1830s to the 1890s, more than 200 state and national colored conventions brought tens of thousands of Black men and women together to organize for racial justice. The first California Colored Convention was called for at the Athenaeum in 1855. James Dyer was a San Francisco County representative to that convention, which petitioned the state legislature for the right of colored people to testify against whites. Two famous cases illustrate the racism of the laws at that time. In the first, in 1861, a white man shot and murdered a Black barber whose barber shop was in the Niantic Hotel, a building that had once been a large ship moored in the San Francisco harbor. But because the witnesses were Black, there was no testimony against the murderer, who received a minimal sentence. The second case involved Mifflin Gibbs, who had traveled with Frederick Douglass on an abolitionist speaking tour, and his partner Philip Lester. The two men established the wildly successful Clay Street Pioneer Shoe and Boot Emporium. When two white men entered their store, stole shoes, and severely beat Lester, Mr. Gibbs was not allowed to testify against them. Mifflin Gibbs became a publisher of the Mirror of Our Times, California's first Black newspaper. Both Gibbs and Lester became leading activists in the Black community, and the two partners refused to pay the poll tax because they could not vote, a move which ended the tax's enforcement. Also, Mr. Gibbs may have hidden fugitive enslaved people in his store's basement until they could secretly board ships bound for South America. The colored conventions also fought for the right to vote for colored men and petitioned for schools for colored children. In 1855, when Mr. Dyer's daughter Anne was 5, she would have walked around the corner to the first segregated school for Black children in California in the basement of St. Cyprian Church, where 45 children of all grades were taught in one classroom. James Dyer was also on the executive committee of the Fourth Convention and served on the Industrial Pursuits Committee, which resolved that our colored traders, mechanics, and manufacturers receive from us every encouragement possible. As president of the Athenaeum, James Dyer endorsed the Pacific Appeal newspaper, founded by Philip Bell, as the official organ of the colored citizens of San Francisco. The paper's motto was, "He who would be free himself must strike the blow." James Dyer was also on the board of trustees of the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, where he served as delegate to an 1863 convention of AME ministers from Pacific states and British Columbia, which had the goal of breaking down geographical barriers and imagining the African American citizens living in different places as one extended Black community. In 1868, Mr. Dyer collected contributions for the Reverend T.M. Ward, known as Old Man Eloquent, who nurtured the AME Church and spoke out against the gold rush's materialistic culture. In 1865, Mr. Dyer's New England soap and tallow factory opened on the site of the current UPS building. But sadly, the new Potrero factory was entirely destroyed only a year later. It seems the Brannan Street Bridge over Mission Creek was closed and fire engines were slow to reach the fire which consumed the building. The 1866 fire loss was estimated at $20,000, and the remaining equipment and materials were auctioned. But in spite of that huge loss, that year, Mr. Dyer served as vice president in charge of a celebration of the second anniversary of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and he would serve as president on the fifth anniversary. James Dyer took a trip to the Calistoga Hot Springs for his health, but on June 17, 1869, James P. Dyer, now 50 years old, died following a heart attack. James P. Dyer was warmly remembered in obituaries and poems to his memory. The Elevator stated, "He was just in all his dealings, strictly honest, temperate in his habits, generous to a fault. His heart was ever open to the calls of distress, and his hand followed the impulses of his heart. Every enterprise which had for its object the progress of our people found in him a steady supporter." The factory would continue as Queen Lily Soap Factory, Fishbeck and Glutes Soap, and Pioneer Soap at two more Potrero Hill locations. The second near Jackson Park in 1895, and then in the 1920s, that huge wooden building was moved to Carolina and 18th, where it stands today. A building which is part of a story that has almost become forgotten. Neighbors remember Queen Lily Soap, which continued production into the 1960s. Researching Mr. Dyer and his fellow Black pioneers has been fascinating, and while much of the story was shocking, it was even more shocking to me how little of this history I knew. Bronze plaques honoring James Dyer at the site of his first factory on Mason Street and at the Queen Lily building on Potrero Hill would be a first step in restoring this history. Our country is confronting its record on race, and the stories of these pioneers should become familiar chapters. People of color did not find a promised land in California, but came together to fight for racial equality and had many successes. Celebrating these people and recognizing what they achieved gives us hope in continuing their unfinished fight. And I really want to thank several people who generously contributed to this project: Susan Anderson, Lisa Heyer, Robert Maker, and Hudson Bell. Thank you very much.